I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might drown out the voices. The sound of my wife, Jennifer, laughing, a sound I once cherished, was now an ice pick to my chest. The laughter wasn't meant for me. It was meant for the man seated across from her, his smug smirk plastered on his face. Jennifer's hair was perfect, makeup flawless, and she was leaning in like she was hanging on every word this guy, let's call him Brandon, had to say. It wasn't just the body language that screamed affair. It was the way she looked at him, like he hung the moon, a look she hadn't given me in months. I had come home early from work, tired of long hours at the office and desperate to surprise her with dinner. A stupid plan now, in hindsight. What I found instead made me drop the takeout bags on the floor. Tom. Jennifer gasped, her face flashing through a series of expressions, shock, guilt, and then something that made my stomach churn, irritation. Brandon didn't flinch. He casually leaned back in his chair, looked me up and down like I was the interloper in my own home, and said, "You should have knocked." The audacity. My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might shatter. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, though I knew the answer. Jennifer stood abruptly, brushing her hands down her dress as if that could wipe away the evidence. Tom, calm down. It's not what it looks like. It looks like my wife is cozying up to another man, I snapped, my voice rising despite myself. So what is it, Jennifer? A study group? Bible study? Brandon had the nerve to laugh. He's got a sense of humor, he said, shaking his head like we were old friends sharing a joke. I wanted to punch him right then and there, but Jennifer stepped between us, her hands on my chest. Tom, stop. You're overreacting. Overreacting? My head was spinning, but I couldn't let myself spiral. I stepped back, took a deep breath, and forced my voice to steady. Jennifer, tell me the truth. Are you cheating on me? Her eyes darted away, just for a second, but it was enough. I knew. I didn't need her to say it, but she did anyway, her tone clipped and defensive. Fine. Yes. Are you happy now? Happy? I felt like I'd been gutted. Brandon leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and added fuel to the fire. You've been neglecting her, man. She deserves better. Before I could respond, he stood up, towering over me. In fact, he said, pulling something out of his jacket that made my blood run cold, I'll show you how much better. It was a gun. Jennifer screamed, stepping back as Brandon pointed the barrel at me. Now I'm going to sleep with her, he said, his voice chillingly calm, and if you interfere, I'll blow your head off. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to fight, to tackle this smug bastard and knock the weapon out of his hand, but the cold reality of the situation held me in place. I was unarmed, unprepared, and completely blindsided. Brandon. Jennifer shouted, but there was no real panic in her voice. No desperate plea to save my life. If anything, it was annoyance. Shut up, Jennifer, Brandon said, his focus still locked on me. My mind raced, weighing my options. The anger boiling in my veins fought with the sheer terror of having a gun aimed at my head. I couldn't let this happen. I wouldn't. Fine, I said finally, my voice strained but steady. You win. Just don't hurt her. Brandon chuckled, lowering the gun slightly. Smart choice. Jennifer didn't even look at me as they disappeared into the bedroom. The sound of the door clicking shut felt like the final nail in the coffin of my marriage. For a long moment, I stood there, paralyzed by a storm of emotions, rage, humiliation, heartbreak. Then something in me snapped. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this. The wheels in my head started turning. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stayed frozen in place, fists clenched at my sides as the bedroom door shut. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, rage, disbelief, humiliation, but one thought rose above all others: this isn't the end. I glanced at the gun Brandon had waved in my face moments ago. It had been real. The cold sweat on my back confirmed that. My first instinct was to storm out, call the cops, and have them drag his smug ass out of my house. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that wasn't enough. A man like him would only laugh about it later, and Jennifer, she wouldn't care. No, this required something more deliberate. Something final. The minutes ticked by like hours. I could hear muffled laughter from behind the closed door, voices raised in a way that made my blood boil. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the sheer lack of respect. Jennifer didn't care about me. She didn't care about our years together, the promises we made, or the sacrifices I had made for her. And Brandon? He was just a parasite, feeding off her lies and my misery. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my car keys and left, slamming the front door behind me. Let them think I was running away, defeated. Let them laugh at my expense for now. It wouldn't last. As I drove aimlessly through the dark streets of our quiet suburb, my thoughts kept looping back to that gun, the casual way Brandon had pulled it out, like it was some toy to intimidate me. My heart pounded at the memory. The fear was still there, but something else burned brighter now: determination. I pulled into the parking lot of a nearby diner, one of those all-night joints where the coffee is bad, and the waitresses call you "hun." I needed a moment to think, to strategize. I grabbed a booth in the corner and ordered black coffee, more for something to do with my hands than for any desire to drink it. Jennifer's voice echoed in my mind, her indifference when she confessed to the affair. Fine. Yes. Are you happy now? The bitterness in her tone was like acid. She wasn't even sorry. No excuses, no regrets, just a cold, dismissive admission. I took a sip of the coffee and grimaced. Bitter, like my mood. My phone buzzed on the table, dragging me back to reality. It was a text, from Jennifer. "You're being dramatic. Just come home so we can talk." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. Dramatic? She wanted to talk now, after everything? The sheer audacity of it made me want to throw the phone across the room. Instead, I typed back. Talk about what? How you let that guy wave a gun in my face. How you cheated on me in our home. The reply came almost instantly. It's not that serious, Tom. You're overreacting, as usual. Not that serious. My hands trembled as I put the phone down, unwilling to dignify that with a response. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream. How had it come to this? How had I ended up married to someone so devoid of empathy, so utterly selfish? The waitress came by, refilling my coffee without asking. Rough night? She asked, her tone sympathetic. I managed a tight smile. You have no idea. She nodded like she'd heard it all before and left me to stew in my thoughts. By the time I finished my coffee, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I wasn't going to confront Brandon head-on, not yet. He had the gun, after all, and I wasn't eager to test how serious he was about using it. No, I needed leverage, something that would hit him where it hurt. I drove back home, parking a few blocks away and walking the rest of the distance. The house was dark now, the smug laughter and muffled voices replaced by silence. I slipped inside, careful not to make a sound. My goal wasn't to confront them, it was to gather evidence. Proof of their betrayal, something I could use to protect myself in the days to come. The house felt like a stranger's as I moved through it, avoiding creaky floorboards and keeping to the shadows. I went to the bedroom first, heart pounding as I cracked the door open. Brandon was sprawled on the bed, shirtless, snoring loudly. Jennifer was beside him, her back turned to the door. My stomach churned at the sight, but I forced myself to stay focused. I crept into the living room, finding Jennifer's laptop on the coffee table. She'd always been careless about passwords, and tonight was no exception. I guessed it on the third try, our anniversary date, ironically enough. As the screen unlocked, I started digging. Emails, text logs, photos. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There it was, a trail of messages between her and Brandon, spanning months. Plans to meet, declarations of affection, and the occasional insult directed at me. My jaw tightened as I read their words. They thought they were so clever, so untouchable. But now I had the upper hand. I copied everything onto a flash drive I'd brought with me, double-checking to make sure I hadn't missed anything. As I slipped the drive into my pocket, a voice behind me made my blood run cold. "What the hell are you doing, Tom?" I turned to find Jennifer standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of anger and confusion. Her lover was still in the bedroom, oblivious. But this? This was just the beginning. Jennifer's glare cut through the dark like a blade, her arms crossed as she stepped closer. She wasn't trying to hide anything anymore. The guilt, if there ever was any, had evaporated completely. She looked at me like I was the intruder here, in my own home. "What are you doing?" she repeated, her voice low but sharp. I held her gaze, the flash drive burning in my pocket like a loaded weapon. "What does it look like, Jennifer?" "I'm gathering evidence." "You think you and your boyfriend can humiliate me and just walk away unscathed?" Her eyes narrowed, the defiance in her expression only fueling my anger. "Evidence? For what? A sob story? A pity party? Grow up, Tom." I stepped closer, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get to tell me to grow up. You brought this into our lives. You invited him in here. You betrayed me." Jennifer scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Oh, please. Don't act like this is all my fault. You're the one who's been checked out for years. Always working late, always distracted. You don't even look at me like you used to." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of her excuses. "So your solution was to jump into bed with some lowlife? That's rich, Jennifer. Real mature." Her expression shifted then, the smugness melting into something colder, sharper. "You don't know what it's like, Tom. To feel invisible. To feel like the person who's supposed to love you doesn't even see you anymore." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit, but I refused to let her twist this. "If that's how you felt, you should have said something. We could have worked on it. But no, you decided to blow up our marriage instead." Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open, and there he was, Brandon. Shirtless, rubbing his eyes, looking like he'd been woken from the dead. His confusion turned to irritation as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Jennifer turned to him, her tone softening in a way that made my stomach churn. "Tom's just leaving. Aren't you, Tom?" I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to knock that smug look off his face. "Actually, I'm not. We're not done here." Brandon smirked, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place. "Yeah, I think you are. Why don't you run along before things get ugly?" It was the way he said it, so casual, so dismissive, that made something snap inside me. Before I could stop myself, I lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of panic. "What the hell, man?" Jennifer screamed, grabbing my arm, but I shrugged her off. My voice was a low growl as I got in his face. "You think you can waltz into my house, sleep with my wife, and threaten me with a gun? You've got another thing coming." "Tom! Stop!" Jennifer shouted, but I didn't care. Brandon squirmed in my grip, but I was stronger, angrier. He raised his hands in surrender, trying to defuse the situation. "Hey, man, let's talk about this." "No," I snapped, cutting him off. "You had your chance to talk when you pointed that gun at me." The memory of that moment burned in my mind, fueling my rage. But then, just as quickly as it started, I let him go, stepping back and watching as he slumped to the floor, gasping for breath. Jennifer rushed to his side, her eyes blazing with fury as she turned on me. "Are you happy now, Tom? Is this who you've become?" "Don't you dare," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Don't you dare act like I'm the bad guy here." And then, as if the universe wasn't done throwing curveballs, there was a knock at the door. All three of us froze, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Are you expecting someone?" Brandon asked, his voice shaky. Jennifer shook her head, looking genuinely nervous for the first time all night. I moved toward the door cautiously, glancing back at them. "Stay here," I said, though I doubted they'd listen. When I opened the door, I was greeted by two uniformed police officers. "Mr. Peterson?" one of them asked, glancing at his notepad. "Yes," I said, my stomach sinking. "What's this about?" The officer's expression was unreadable as he replied, "We received a report about a domestic disturbance and a possible firearm involved." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced back at Brandon and Jennifer, who were now peeking out from the hallway, looking as guilty as sin. "Care to explain?" the officer asked. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. This was it, the moment where everything could either implode or shift in my favor. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the man who had destroyed my life. "You might want to talk to him. He's the one who brought the gun." Brandon's face turned ghostly white as the officers turned their attention to him. Jennifer's jaw dropped, her perfect little facade crumbling before my eyes. It wasn't over yet. But the tide was finally turning. The air in the room was thick with tension as the officers stepped inside, their expressions stern and professional. Brandon was frozen in place, his eyes darting between me and the cops, calculating his next move. Jennifer's face, once smug and defiant, was now a mask of panic. "Sir," one of the officers said, addressing me directly, "can you tell us exactly what's going on here?" I glanced at Brandon, then back at the officer. "This man," I said, pointing at him, "came into my house, threatened me with a firearm, and is having an affair with my wife." Brandon sputtered, his hands shooting up defensively. Whoa, that's not true. He's twisting everything." One of the officers raised an eyebrow. "Is there a firearm involved?" Brandon hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Jennifer, who seemed paralyzed by the unfolding events. That hesitation was all the confirmation the officer needed. "Stay where you are," he commanded, reaching for his radio. Jennifer, finally snapping out of her stupor, stepped forward, her voice high and strained. "Wait. This is a misunderstanding. It's not what it looks like." The officer turned his attention to her, his tone calm but firm. "Ma'am, we'll get to the bottom of this, but right now, we need to secure the situation. Where's the gun?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. "It's in the bedroom," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos. The officers exchanged a look before one of them motioned for Brandon to stay put while the other headed toward the bedroom. Brandon started to protest, but the officer's hand moved subtly toward his holster, and he thought better of it. Jennifer turned on me, her eyes blazing with fury. "Tom, what the hell are you doing? Are you trying to ruin everything?" "Ruin what, Jennifer?" I shot back, my voice rising. "The sham of a marriage you've been faking? Or the pathetic fantasy you've built with this loser?" Her face flushed crimson, and for a moment, I thought she might slap me. But instead, she let out a humorless laugh. "You're unbelievable. You're acting like some victim, but maybe if you weren't so useless, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." The words hit like a sucker punch, but I refused to let her see it. Funny, I said coldly. I thought vows meant something. Guess I was wrong. Before she could respond, the officer who had gone to the bedroom returned, holding the gun Brandon had so casually brandished earlier. Found it, he said, holding it up carefully. Brandon's face drained of all color. It's not mine, he stammered. I mean, yeah, I had it, but it's not even loaded. The officer checked the weapon and nodded. He's right, it's unloaded. But waving this around to threaten someone? That's still a serious crime. Brandon took a step forward, his hands still raised. Come on, man, it was just a misunderstanding. I wasn't going to hurt anyone. Tell that to the judge, the officer said curtly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Jennifer lost it. You can't do this, she screamed, stepping between Brandon and the officer. He didn't do anything wrong. Ma'am, step back, the officer warned, his tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to me, her expression wild and desperate. Tom, tell them. Tell them this is all a mistake. I folded my arms, watching as the reality of her choices finally began to dawn on her. No, Jennifer. It's not a mistake. It's exactly what it looks like. Brandon glared at me as the officer cuffed him. You think you've won, don't you? You think this makes you some kind of hero? No, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. It makes me a man who's finally done putting up with your crap. As they led Brandon toward the door, Jennifer followed, pleading with the officers to stop, to reconsider. But it was no use. The sound of the front door slamming shut was like a gavel falling, marking the end of whatever twisted alliance they'd had. For a moment, there was silence. Jennifer turned back to me, her face a mix of fury and desperation. Are you happy now? She hissed. I stared at her, feeling an odd sense of calm wash over me. No, Jennifer. I'm not happy. But I'm done. She blinked, taken aback by the finality in my tone. What does that mean? It means I'm done letting you walk all over me. Done pretending this marriage is salvageable. Done letting you make me feel like I'm not enough. Her eyes welled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from regret or frustration. Maybe both. You're just going to throw everything away? I laughed, a bitter sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. You threw it away, Jennifer. The second you let him into our home, you threw it all away. She stood there, silent for once, as I walked past her and toward the door. Where are you going? She called after me. I paused, hand on the doorknob, and glanced back. To start over. Without you. And then I was gone, stepping into the crisp night air, leaving behind the wreckage of what once was. For the first time in years, I felt free. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it didn't soothe the fire roaring in my chest. The weight of what had just happened was pressing down on me, yet underneath it was an odd sense of relief. I walked aimlessly for a while, the empty street stretching out before me like a blank canvas. What now? The question loomed large. Everything I'd built with Jennifer, for better or worse, was gone. But in its place, there was possibility, if I could figure out how to seize it. Half an hour later, I found myself parked in front of a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the cracked pavement. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. As I checked in, the woman behind the counter gave me a polite smile, though her eyes lingered on the tired lines of my face. Rough night? She asked, echoing the diner waitress from earlier. I let out a dry chuckle. You could say that. With a key in hand, I headed to my room and sank onto the stiff bed. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to exhale. But the calm didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and the sight of Jennifer's name on the screen sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. I almost ignored it but decided against it. If she had something to say, I was ready to hear it. I swiped to answer. "What do you want, Jennifer?" I asked, my voice flat. Her response came quickly, her tone clipped and defensive. "You didn't have to do that, Tom." "Calling the cops?" That was a low blow. I laughed bitterly. "A low blow? You're kidding me, right? After everything you and your boyfriend pulled, you think I'm the bad guy here?" "Brandon didn't deserve that," she snapped. "Oh, but I did." I fired back, my voice rising. "I deserve to be humiliated in my own home? To have a gun waved in my face like I'm some kind of animal?" There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she might actually apologize. But instead, she sighed, the sound dripping with exasperation. "You're so dramatic, Tom. This whole thing could have been avoided if you weren't so predictable." "Predictable?" I repeated, the word tasting like poison. "What does that even mean?" "It means you're boring, Tom," she said, her voice cutting. "You think being a good provider and a decent guy is enough, but it's not." I wanted excitement, passion. "And you?" she trailed off, as if the words were too cruel to finish. But I got the message loud and clear. My jaw tightened as I gripped the phone. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You destroy everything we had, and now you're trying to rewrite the story to make me the villain?" "Newsflash, Jennifer, this isn't about me being predictable. It's about you being selfish." She didn't respond, but I could hear her breathing on the other end. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now. "So what happens now, Tom? Are you just done with me?" I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the cracked ceiling. "Yeah, Jennifer. I think I am." The line went silent for a long moment before she hung up without another word. I stared at the phone, my chest heavy with a mixture of sadness and relief. But as I set the phone down, a nagging thought crept into my mind. Jennifer's voice had sounded off, not just defensive, but nervous. And then there was Brandon. He'd seemed oddly confident for a man caught with his hand in someone else's cookie jar. It didn't add up. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. Maybe I was overthinking things. Or maybe there was more to this story than I realized. The next morning, I was woken by a knock at the door. Groggy, I stumbled over and opened it, half expecting to see Jennifer standing there. But instead, it was one of the police officers from the night before. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "What's this about?" The officer removed his hat, his demeanor serious. "We've been looking into the incident from last night, and some things have come to light that you might want to know about." My stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" He hesitated, then pulled out a notepad. "For starters, Brandon Michaels isn't who he claims to be. He's got a record, fraud, breaking and entering, even a restraining order or two. We're still digging, but it looks like he's been running scams for years." My mind raced. Scams? What does that have to do with Jennifer? The officer met my gaze, his expression grim. "That's the thing. We think she might be in on it." The words hit me like a freight train. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my heart pounding. "In on it? You think Jennifer's involved?" "It's a possibility," he said carefully. "We found some suspicious financial activity linked to both of them, large transfers, offshore accounts. It's too early to say for sure, but if I were you, I'd keep my guard up." I stared at him, struggling to process what he was saying. Jennifer wasn't just unfaithful, she might have been using me the whole time. The officer stood, his expression softening. "We'll keep you updated as we learn more. In the meantime, take care of yourself." As he left, I sat there in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Jennifer's betrayal ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. And now, it was my turn to act. This wasn't over. The officer's words hung in the air long after he left. I couldn't sit still, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to but couldn't ignore. Jennifer had betrayed me in more ways than one, and the idea that she'd been plotting with Brandon against me sent a cold shiver down my spine. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through our bank accounts, something I hadn't done in months. Jennifer had always handled the finances, claiming it was her way of contributing while I worked long hours. I'd trusted her, blindly, it seemed. The numbers didn't add up. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize, transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. I dug deeper, my unease growing with every click. Offshore accounts. Thousands of dollars funneled out in neat, regular sums. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pieced it together. She hadn't just cheated on me, she'd stolen from me. From us. Before I could think, I called the officer who'd come to my motel room. He picked up on the second ring. "Officer Davis," he said briskly. "It's Tom Peterson," I said, my voice tight. "I found something. Bank accounts, offshore, thousands of dollars missing. I don't know how she hid this, but she did." There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Peterson, this aligns with what we're investigating. Can you send us the details?" "Already on it," I said, opening my laptop and typing furiously. When I hung up, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting, I was fighting back. Later that evening, I parked a few blocks away from my house, watching from the shadows. I knew Jennifer was still there, her car was in the driveway. Brandon might have been gone, thanks to the cops, but I wasn't stupid enough to think she was entirely alone. My instincts were right. A man I didn't recognize stepped out of a sleek black car and walked up to my front door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed money. Jennifer greeted him at the door, her demeanor tense but composed. I watched as they stepped inside, my heart pounding. Who was this guy? Another lover? Or someone tied to the web of lies she and Brandon had spun? I waited a few minutes before getting out of my car and creeping toward the house. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of light spilled through the gap, giving me a narrow view of the living room. The man was pacing, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to Jennifer. She stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of irritation. I couldn't hear their words, but the tension was palpable. Suddenly, he pulled out a briefcase and opened it on the coffee table. Inside were stacks of cash, more money than I'd ever seen in my life. Jennifer glanced at it, then at him, her expression unreadable. I felt sick. What the hell was she into? Before I could think about my next move, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I scrambled to silence it, but it was too late. The noise caught Jennifer's attention, and she turned toward the window. Our eyes met. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then she shouted something, and the man turned to look. His hand went to his waistband, and I realized he was armed. Cursing under my breath, I bolted back toward my car. I didn't look back to see if they followed, I didn't need to. The adrenaline pumping through my veins told me everything I needed to know. I just stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple affair. Back at the motel, I paced the room, my mind racing. Who was the guy? What was the money for? And why was Jennifer so willing to risk everything? I called Officer Davis again, filling him in on what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Mr. Peterson, I need you to be very careful. If these people are involved in criminal activity, they won't hesitate to protect their interests." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice tight. "Stay put," he said firmly. "We're looking into it. Don't confront her again, and don't go back to the house." It was sound advice, but I wasn't sure I could follow it. I needed answers, and waiting around for the police to piece things together wasn't going to cut it. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I contacted a private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa who came highly recommended. When I told her my story, she didn't bat an eye. "I've seen worse," she said bluntly. "If your wife's involved in something shady, we'll find out." She got to work immediately, combing through financial records, surveillance footage, and any leads she could dig up. Meanwhile, I kept a low profile, watching from the sidelines as my life unraveled further. A week later, Lisa called with an update. "Your wife's boyfriend, Brandon. He's part of a criminal ring. Fraud, money laundering, you name it. The guy who came to your house. Likely his handler, or worse, someone he owes." My stomach churned. "And Jennifer?" Lisa hesitated. "It's not clear yet. She might be a pawn, or she might be in deeper than you think. Either way, she's complicit." I hung up, staring at the wall of my motel room. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger, her secrets darker than I'd ever imagined. The realization hit me like a freight train: this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about survival. And I wasn't going to let her destroy me. The air in the motel room felt thick as I sat in silence, processing what Lisa had uncovered. Jennifer wasn't just a liar or a cheat, she was part of something criminal, something dangerous. And I was smack in the middle of it, like a deer in the headlights of an oncoming truck. I couldn't sit still any longer. The walls seemed to close in around me, my thoughts spiraling. Why had I let this happen? How had I been so blind? But self-pity wasn't going to get me anywhere. I needed to act. Lisa called again that afternoon. "Tom," she began, her tone urgent. "I've got something. There's a warehouse on the edge of town, owned by a shell company tied to Brandon and your wife. They've been using it for some kind of operation." "What kind of operation?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Hard to say without going in, but I wouldn't recommend it. These people aren't amateurs, and if they catch you—" "I'm not afraid of them," I interrupted, more forcefully than I felt. Lisa sighed. "Look, I get it. You want answers. But there's a difference between being brave and being reckless. Let me handle this." But I couldn't let her handle it. This was personal now. If Jennifer was using me, destroying everything we'd built, I needed to know the full extent of it. That evening, I found myself driving toward the warehouse. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shadow. The address Lisa gave me led to a desolate industrial area, the kind of place no one would go unless they had a reason, or a death wish. I parked a block away and approached on foot, sticking to the shadows. The building was massive, its corrugated metal walls reflecting the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. A single car was parked outside, a nondescript sedan that screamed undercover. As I crept closer, the sound of muffled voices reached my ears. I pressed myself against the cold metal of the warehouse, peering through a grimy window. Inside, Jennifer stood with Brandon and the man from the other night, the one in the suit. A fourth man was there too, his back to me, his posture tense. On a table between them lay stacks of cash, documents, and what looked like a duffel bag filled with something I couldn't make out. I strained to hear their conversation, catching snippets of their argument. "You told me this was low risk," Jennifer snapped, her voice cold and sharp. "Now we've got cops sniffing around and my idiot husband asking questions." "Your husband," the man in the suit said, his tone mocking. "He's more of a problem than you led us to believe. You assured me he wouldn't get in the way." "He won't," Brandon interjected, his voice smug. "The guy's harmless. A pushover." I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to storm inside and prove him wrong. "We need to move the operation," the suit said. "Tonight." The cops are getting too close. Jennifer crossed her arms, her lips curling into a sneer. And what about me? You think I'm sticking around if this goes south? The suit stepped closer to her, his tone dark. You don't have a choice. You're in this as deep as the rest of us. Suddenly, the fourth man, the one with his back to me, turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of his face. My stomach dropped. It was Officer Davis. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. The cop who'd been helping me was in on it too. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was Lisa in danger? Was I? As I turned to leave, my foot caught on a loose piece of gravel, sending it skittering across the ground. The sound was faint, but it was enough. The voices inside stopped. I bolted toward my car, not daring to look back. The door of the warehouse slammed open behind me, followed by the sound of footsteps and angry shouts. Hey! Stop! I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as panic surged through me. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, glancing in the rearview mirror. A figure stood in the middle of the road, watching me disappear into the night. Back at the motel, I locked the door and sat with my head in my hands. This was worse than I'd thought. Jennifer wasn't just a participant in Brandon's schemes, she was deeply entrenched, tied to criminals and dirty cops. My phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Lisa. "Tom, you need to get out of town," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Right now." "What's going on?" I demanded. "I found out about Davis," she said. "He's been working with Brandon for years. If they know you've been digging, they'll come after you." "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "I can't. This isn't just about me anymore." "Then be careful," Lisa said. "And trust no one." The next day, I made my way to the police station, determined to find someone I could trust. But as I approached the front desk, a familiar voice stopped me in my tracks. Well. Look who's here." I turned to see Davis leaning casually against the wall, a smirk on his face. "You've been busy, Tom," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe too busy." I stared at him, my fists clenched. "You're dirty," I said, my voice low. "And I'm going to prove it." Davis chuckled, his eyes glinting with malice. "Good luck with that. But a word of advice? Watch your back. Accidents happen." I left the station, my hands shaking. The war had just begun, and I wasn't sure if I'd make it out alive. The air felt electric as I drove away from the police station, Davis's threat echoing in my mind. Accidents happen. He wasn't bluffing. I knew now that I was deep in a pit, surrounded by snakes, but the one thing I hadn't lost was my resolve. Jennifer, Brandon, Davis, they weren't going to win. I made one last call to Lisa, my voice shaking but firm. "We need to move fast. I want every piece of evidence you've got, records, photos, anything. I'm going public." "Public?" Lisa sounded startled. "Tom, that's risky. If these people catch wind of it before it gains traction, you're done for." "I don't care," I said through gritted teeth. "I'm not hiding anymore." By the next morning, I had everything Lisa had uncovered. Bank transfers, photos of Brandon meeting with Davis, and even a few audio recordings of Jennifer discussing their schemes. It wasn't just damning, it was a roadmap to their entire operation. I uploaded everything to a secure folder and sent it to a few local reporters. I wasn't naive enough to think they'd act immediately, but the evidence was strong. It would force their hand. Then I prepared for the final confrontation. That evening, I returned to the house, the place I'd once called home, now just a stage for the twisted drama of Jennifer's betrayal. The house was dark, but her car was in the driveway. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the air heavy with silence. Jennifer was in the living room, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. When she looked up and saw me, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she snapped. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "I think we're past talking, don't you?" "Maybe," I said, stepping closer. "But I need answers." "Why, Jennifer? Why did you do this? To me, to us?" She smirked, her tone dripping with venom. "Oh, spare me the wounded husband routine. You think you're some kind of saint? You were so wrapped up in your work, in your perfect little world, you didn't even notice when I started slipping away." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. "That doesn't justify stealing from me. Or screwing around with criminals." "Justify?" she sneered. "You have no idea what it's like to feel trapped, to live in someone else's shadow. Brandon saw me. He made me feel alive." "Alive?" I laughed bitterly. "He's a con artist, Jennifer. And now, so are you." Her face twisted in anger. "You think you're so much better than me? You're just a pathetic little man who couldn't even keep his own wife." I took a step back, her words hitting harder than I expected. But then I remembered why I was there. "This ends tonight," I said. "The lies, the money, the manipulation, it's all over." She laughed, a hollow sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You're delusional. You think you can stop us?" "I already have," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. "Everything's out there now, your accounts, your meetings, your dirty deals. It's all in the hands of the press and the cops who aren't on Brandon's payroll." For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. But it was fleeting. "You think that's going to scare me?" she said, stepping closer. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Tom. Brandon won't let this go. Neither will Davis." "Good," I said, meeting her gaze. "Let them come. I'm done hiding." As if on cue, there was a loud crash from the back of the house. I turned just in time to see Brandon and Davis storming in, their faces twisted with fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" Brandon growled, his hand reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. "Stopping you," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. Davis stepped forward, his grin predatory. "You really screwed up, Peterson. You should have stayed in your little motel and kept your mouth shut." Before I could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows, and I felt a surge of hope. Brandon and Davis exchanged panicked looks, their confidence faltering. "What did you do?" Jennifer hissed, her face pale. "I told you," I said, stepping back toward the door. "It's over." The front door burst open, and uniformed officers flooded the room. Brandon tried to draw his gun, but they were faster. Davis didn't resist, his face a mask of defeat. Jennifer turned to me, her expression unreadable. "You think this is a victory?" she said quietly. "You've ruined everything." "No," I said, my voice firm. "You did that yourself." As the cops led them away, I stood outside, breathing in the cool night air. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The aftermath wasn't easy. The press had a field day with the story, and I had to rebuild my life from the ground up. But I wasn't alone. Lisa stayed in touch, helping me navigate the chaos, and I even started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma. In the end, I learned something invaluable: betrayal doesn't define you. How you rise from it does. Jennifer and her crew had tried to destroy me, but I'd survived. And as I looked toward the future, I knew one thing for certain: I'd never let anyone take my peace away again.